if we were exposed to the truth that our being and everything that exists is submerged in God's thought, we would no longer have any independent sense of self, nor would we have any sense of anxiety or stress or any of those fun things. We would completely lose our sense of self. We would be batal b'metzias, complete lack of self and identity. The tzimtzum, God's diminishments of his endless light, is what the Torah refers to as the hiding of God's face, a process of hiding and obscuring the light and life energy which comes from God's speech. So interestingly, the hiding of God's face, Hester Panim, is actually the source where we see Esther's name in the Torah, Esther from the Purim story. Okay, so the tzimtzum is powerful diminishments and contractions of God's light to the point that we're actively receiving God's light, and yes, we don't feel it. We feel like we are our own independent, man-made person, right? We feel like, I got myself here. I'm just an independent existence. I'm giving myself my own oxygen, and we do not feel ourselves to be actively created, and that is because of these powerful tzimtzumim, these powerful constrictions, which is referring to the hiding of God's face. The tzimtzum creates an illusion where we feel like God's speech, which is enlivening us, is separate from him, same way that our speech is separate from us. So really, the paradigm through which we see the world is how we perceive God. So our baseline paradigm is that we perceive the world as we perceive ourselves. So just like my human speech, when I talk, the words leave me, so I become separate from my speech. So therefore, we kind of put our paradigm of reality on God. And so therefore, we feel like, okay, so just like my speech is separate from me, so God's speech is separate from him. And this isn't intellectual. This is just in the way we perceive reality, is that we're separate from God. God spoke the world into existence, and now we're separated from him. And so we feel ourselves to be these separate entities. But when we're able to shift this paradigm as much as we can using Chassidus, and really understand that no, God's speech is like thought. We remain one with God, like our thoughts are one with us. And we're able to shift that paradigm around. We're able to start allowing ourselves to intellectually generate this feeling of, I live within God. I exist within God. Now, does that mean that we're going to naturally feel it? No. But Chassidus is giving us a constant taste of the messianic reality of Mashiach, of redemptive living, Gula consciousness. And in the days of Mashiach, what we're going to experience is that cosmic blink of God constantly recreating us. We are going to feel that we are being created through God's speech actively in every moment. We're going to feel the purpose and the power of being spoken into existence every single moment. And so even though right now, our paradigm is that we feel separate from God, because we feel like God's speech is separate from him, we can intellectually appreciate how we exist within God, like a person's thought exists within them. We want to explore higher unity versus lower unity. These are two major concepts, okay? So in Chassidus language, lingo, we call it Das Elyon versus Das Tachton, okay? So higher consciousness versus lower consciousness. God created a perspective called lower unity. That's our paradigm. We feel ourselves to be separate. We feel ourselves to be separate from everything else in this room. We see the world through a paradigm, through a lens of separation. Versus from God's perspective, there's been no diminishments, hiding or concealment that would hide or conceal anything in his presence. From God's perspective, there is no tzimtzum. He feels us to be completely one with him, like a person's thought is one with them. For Hashem, there is no diminishment, there is no hiding of this connection. For God, the relationship is as real and raw and as live as ever. From our perspective, from Das Tachton, from his lower unity, we feel ourselves to be separate from our source. So we can use this as an analogy. Like, let's say you want to explain something to a child. And so you take a complex concept in mathematics, and you use a simple analogy in order to explain it so the child can understand. So from the child's perspective, they're only receiving the tzimtzum version. They're only receiving the diminished version of the original light of that idea. But for you, when you say the simple analogy, within that simple analogy, you feel and you see and perceive the light, which is the greater expansiveness of that idea. So for God, when he conceals his endless light, for us to be able to perceive ourselves as independent existence in this world, he's creating the world, he's creating that analogy, so to speak. And from God's perspective, he sees right through it. He sees through all the tzimtzumim. For God, there's no hester upon him. From God's perspective, there's no tzimtzum, no diminishments. To God, darkness is the same as light. Tehillim 139. And later into that same psalm it says, even the darkness does not obscure you. right? It's from our perspective that we perceive ourselves to be separate, not from God's. So this is one of my all-time favorite ways that Chassidus explains this concept, okay? So like the turtle, whose garment, the shell hides it with a part of its own body. Meaning, how does the turtle hide itself? With its shell. And the shell is part of it. God hides himself with himself. There's nothing other than God. So what's God going to hide himself with? Himself, okay? So let's put that into Hasidic terminology. A paradigm shift up ahead. God's concealment and the fact that we don't see God is also God, right? Because what else is God going to conceal himself with, right? Just like the turtle that hides using his own shell. For Havaya is Elohim. Havaya equals God's power of revelation. Versus Elohim, a different name for God, represents God's simsum, God's power of concealment. Havaya is Elohim, right? It's the same God who is transcendent is the same God who is concealing himself. Right? It's the same God. Hashem just expressing himself versus his power of not expressing himself. God is hiding himself with himself. The fact that we do feel ourselves to be independent existence, that's also God. Ultimately, Havaya is Elohim. Both the light and the veil are both God, which means God can be found in every place and in every experience. No matter how thick the tzimtzum, the diminishments of God's light is, no matter how dark and scary a situation is, no matter how godless a moment might feel, God is concealing himself with himself, meaning we can equally find God in this world as in the higher worlds from this perspective. In terms of revelation, of course, it's a huge variance from one moment to the next in terms of God's revelation. But they're all equally God. We're just experiencing different dimensions of godliness, whether that be Havaya, God's revelation, or Elohim, God concealing himself. God's concealment shows us his awesomeness. Tzimtzum is us experiencing God's guvura, God's power. Meaning, we might feel like it's better just to experience God's revelation, right? God's as Havaya. And yes, it is a clearly epic dimension of godliness. But think about it. God has the ability to conceal himself. God is currently enlivening people in this world who are saying, I don't believe in God. Think about what a trip that is. God is actively enlivening a person who's saying, I don't believe in God. That is such a level of concealment that a person can actively be created by their source and yet not feel it. So actually through the symptom, through these diminishments, we're experiencing God's power of concealment. And that's also God. So we're not choked up and caught up in how we want to experience God. And we're just open to experience Hashem, open to experience godliness. Then we can enjoy the tzimtzum just as much as we can enjoy God's revelation, because it's all him, right? We're enjoying the turtle shell or the turtle. It's all him. Yeah, it's pretty powerful. Okay. Now that we appreciate how for God there is no tzimtzum, and true reality is that we exist within God. We exist in God! Okay? Now we appreciate how according to higher unity consciousness, aka reality, we're calling it higher unity consciousness, God's perspective. That's just reality, right? And without these lenses of illusion. In his presence, everything is considered like zero, meaning it has no independent existence. So God does not see the world as something separate from him, because it isn't. So that leaves us with a question. Does it mean the world doesn't exist? If it's just from our perspective that it exists, right? We perceive this world to be an independent existence, but from God's perspective, it's completely one with him. So in his presence, everything is considered like zero, okay? And that like is very important here. The independent world that we see is of zero validity, because it only arises from a false perception, right? The false perception is that we're separate from God. God's speech is separate from him. But the world is not actually zero. It's only like zero, because the force which maintains our perspective, the Tzimtzum Israel, meaning the Tzimtzum Israel, in terms of those diminishments of light, are real from whose perspective? From our perspective. That is a real reality that God created. But is the reality real? No, the illusion is real. But in the reality that we exist within God, and that this world is considered like zero before him, that's a true reality. But the veils that God places, the illusion is real in context of, yeah, it really does create an illusion. So take a moment to wrap your head around that and just dissolve into the unity. Thanks for taking the time to learn together today.